This is part 5 in a series of videos in which I'm attempting to repair this HH Tiger CPU computer. In the previous videos I've got as far as stripping the system down, repairing the power supply and tidying up the main board, and I'm finally ready to power the board up. I've got it hooked up to its own supply. I did briefly try it on the bench power supply and it seemed to draw reasonable power. I didn't have anything hooked up to it, so I couldn't see if it was running at all. I've now got it hooked up to its own supply. I've got some longer leads attached to the 5-volt input to the board. I'll need to replace this connector at some point. I've put one of the video cards back in. It's not really necessary to test it. It'll run without that, but it obviously won't display anything on the video. But as I don't have the video hooked up, it doesn't really matter. I've got the indicator LEDs plugged back in. I'm not sure exactly what they would do at power up. They're indicated on the case as power, online and shift lock. So I can experiment now and see what's actually going on, whether there's any activity at all in the system. As I've cleaned all the sockets, I've cleaned the board on both sides, and I'll now go around and see if we've got anything whatsoever going on in the system. What I have on the scope is channel 2, which is the blue trace, is hooked up to the video output. That's the TTL output on the back. Or at least I think it is. I've traced the circuit through and it appears to be going to the right pin on the video output. And channel 1, the yellow channel, is I've got a probe attached, and we'll have a look around and probe about. This is just experimental at this point, just arbitrary testing to see if we've got anything going on at all. Now this is a fairly unusual system in that we have two processors. We've got a 6809 on this side with a few PIAs, and on this side we've got a Z80, and the Z80 is connected and controlling through a DMA chip, and we also have a Z80 PIO as well. Now I'm assuming that the two ROMs on this side are used by the 6809 and that this smaller ROM is used by the Z80. I don't know what the link is between the two. What I've read somewhere is that the 6809 controls in-out and the Z80 is more system. But we'll see what's going on. If the Z80 is system level, then I would expect it to control the overall boot up of the machine. They probably boot up independently with regard to their individual ROMs, but I suspect that the overall system control will be from the Z80. So I'll start with the Z80 and see what's going on. I'll probe the various inputs and buses and see if we get any activity at all. So I'll power up. Okay, that's fairly interesting. We're getting line sync pulses on the video output, which is quite promising. I don't know what format the video is sent out on this, and we'll have to try and figure it out as we go along, but what I'm looking for is some activity that is modified when various things within the system happens. I'm not particularly concerned at the moment what it's outputting. I just want to see if there's anything being controlled by the two processors on the board. So now it's running. I'll try looking for some activity on the Z80. So in particular what I'm looking for is any sign of life. I believe this runs at 4 MHz. That could well be. So yes, we're running at 4 MHz. That's the clock inputs. We are getting clock, which I kind of assume we would be, because we're getting sync pulses going out of the video socket, so the clock had to be running somewhere. So we'll try the various input and output lines on the Z80, and they're all kind of floating. Okay, I suspect this Z80 is not actually working. I'll just try a separate Z80. I'll just try replacing the Z80 and see if that helps. Okay, I've replaced the Z80 and we'll see if that makes any difference. So we're still getting sync pulses on the video out, and now we'll see if we're getting any activity on the Z80, and it appears that we are. Okay, that's looking quite promising. We're getting some what appears to be fairly normal activity on the Z80. We'll check the 6009, see if that's doing anything at all, and that is indeed doing something. Okay, so it looks like there may be more life in this than I thought there would be at first. I've got no idea if it's running and doing what it should do. What I'll do now off camera is just go through and test the various signals on the Z80, see if that's behaving the way I would expect it to. I'll then check the PIAs and PIOs and see if they seem to be doing what I would expect, and then I'll see if I can figure out what the video should be. The video is controlled, I believe, through a dedicated video control chip, so I'll need to try and figure out some way to test that. And then I'll go through the rest of the circuits and see if we're getting any sensible activity, and the next step will then be to hook up a monitor and see if there's anything coming out on that at all. But as I said, I don't know quite how it's meant to be configured on this machine, so I might have to experiment and look at the signals to see exactly what's going on. From what I can gather, these wires that are tacked onto the bottom are just for the modem, so I'm ignoring those at the moment. I'm assuming it doesn't need anything external to allow it to boot up, and same with the video RAM. I don't think having the two additional cards missing or unplugged will prevent it from booting up. So that's it for now. I'll get back on camera once I've made some progress, and as I say, it looks like we've got more life in this machine than I expected at this point. Okay, so it's about 10 minutes later. I've been probing around the board looking for signs of life. Once the Z80 was replaced, we saw it starting to do something, and we saw activity at the 6809 and the Z80, but there was still no apparent video output. I've taken the DRAM card out. We don't really need that for this initial testing. So the way I normally go about fault finding on a board where I don't have any schematics is to look at the basics. So with CPU driven systems, the first thing I look at is the reset lines, make sure they're not stuck holding the system in reset. I was pretty sure that wasn't the case anyway, because we were seeing activity on the address and data lines. So what I do after that is I check the data bus. Without a schematic it can be a bit tricky, because if the data bus is going through buffers, then you can't really easily trace it through. So I tend to do it in stages, and I decided here to start at the video output simply because that's the end of the chain that I'm interested in at this point. So as I said, the video is controlled through a high performance video chip, and so I decided to look at the data lines going into that, and straight away I saw something a bit unusual. So I powered up, and it's the yellow trace we're interested in. Now both of these channels are set to the same amplitude, and you can see that there's something very heavily loading that data bus, and it's way more than the bus is going to be able to handle. And this is the next data line. You can see that's just as bad, if not worse. So there's something loading up the data bus very heavily, and that's going to stop the system working. On top of which, if the device that's loading the data bus up is critical to the system running, then of course the system won't run. So again, without a schematic, what I tend to do is I'll locate any devices directly attached to that data bus, and the easiest way is to get a test meter, put it onto ohms and your beep, You need a fairly fast latching meter to do this. What you can then do is select a data line that you know is being loaded, in this case this one, and then you can trace it around the board, so we know that this comes straight from the processor. And in fact, if I probe that data line on the processor directly and power back up, you can see that the data bus coming directly out of the processor is it's either heavily loaded or the processor is at fault. So before I start swapping the processor out, because if it is something loading it up, I don't want to damage another processor. So what I start doing is looking for other devices attached directly to that data bus. So I go on the same pin, and I can now just drag the probe down various devices. In this case, we've got another pin here. Now, I'm pretty sure it's not the ROM that's causing a problem, because the system does appear to be trying to run code. It could be, but I'm going to assume that at the moment the ROM's not at fault. Also, I've read these ROMs in my programmer, so I know that they work to quite a large extent, so I'm going to ignore that. But you just go around the rest of the system doing the same thing. If you come to a buffer that's connected to the data bus, what I do is I just pop them out. So I've taken them out. I'm not looking to get the unit running here, I'm just trying to find out what's loading the bus down. And as you can see, I've been going around the board taking out various devices that were connected directly to that data bus. Now, when I got to the PIO for the Z80, it is connected directly to the same bus. In fact, there's a huge number of chips on this board connected to the data bus, which is not a good design. Normally you'd go through buffers, otherwise you get this sort of issue cropping up. So we'll pop this one out. We'll get the scope probe and put it back onto the data bus, power up, and you can see now we're getting signals what we would expect to see. If we go back over to the video device, you can see that over there as well we're getting signals that are much better looking, they're the right amplitude, and also they're looking more like the sort of signals you're likely to see in a system like this. If we go to the next line, you can see that's fine as well. So it looks like we've got issues with the Z80 side of things. The PIA's failed, the Z80 CPU has failed, quite possibly the DMA has failed as well. But what I'll do now, I'll pop the rest of the chips back in and see if there's any further activity on the video output line. Okay, I've now got a couple of the DRAM cards plugged in. So these are the video RAM. I've still got the PIO removed, and we'll notice now that the two LEDs that shouldn't be on at this point are actually out. The system doesn't work now properly, of course, because we're missing the PIO, but one thing we'll notice now is we're getting the proper signal coming out of the video connector. Before we were getting 4 microsecond pulses, which is obviously wrong. They're now about sort of 60 microseconds apart, which is what we would be expecting. The other thing is, of course, I plugged the keyboard in, and there is activity now. I can't really see it on the screen on the scope, but if I probe the various lines on the CPUs, then I am seeing a bit of activity in response to pressing keys. The other thing is if I press the reset button, so I don't know if you can hear that, but the LEDs are flashing, so they're probably not on screen. So if I try and get these onto screen, it's really hard to see, but they are now flashing rapidly as I hold the reset button in, and I'm getting a tone through the speaker. So obviously something now is starting to come to life. I suspect if we put a PIO in, it may well start running to a much greater degree. I'm not sure if I've got one of that particular type. I'll have a look. If not, then I'll come back in the next video with an update on how far it took it once I replaced that device. But again, making progress, and does seem to be a lot of life, and I think we're getting a lot closer to the machine actually starting to run.